My work has focused, up till the present, I'm an urban sociologist, and I'm focused on New York City, and particularly moments of crisis in New York City in the 1970s, and then in a kind of comparative fashion with the post-9/11 period. In the aftermath of Katrina, I became interested in thinking about broader interurban comparisons between New York and New Orleans, and particularly this issue of moments of crisis and the response in both cities to these disasters. I think that 9/11 and Katrina became defining events in the new American century in a way, as Anne alluded to. If Katrina was invoked as the kind of harbinger for the decline of the Bush presidency, I think 9/11 was this really significant rallying point in which Bush very symbolically appeared at ground zero with a bullhorn on top of a pile of ashes and used this disaster as a moment to really inaugurate what became this new wave of the global war on terror, despite many of the protests of New Yorkers on the ground there saying our grief is not a cry for war, and a lot of the protests going on at the time. This was a very significant event in symbolically rallying the nation and defining national identity in a new way and a national purpose in a new way. So I think that both 9/11 and Katrina became really important 21st century events in thinking about the status of the United States and the direction of the United States. Before I go into the comparison, however, I want to say that obviously and importantly, the roots and nature of these disasters are very different. One was the result of a terrorist attack. The other was the result of a long-brewing natural disaster, socially caused natural disaster as well. And on many levels, this helps to explain the reasoning behind these different reactions to these events. In addition, and I think also very significantly, the reaction by the federal government was very different, in terms of sheer funding alone. Depending on which category of funding you look at, the federal aid to New York was 10 to 20 times greater per capita than it was for residents of New Orleans. And this is a disaster that occurred in the southern tip of Manhattan versus a disaster in New Orleans that came close to wiping out the city and large swaths of the city, many of which are still remain unrecovered. So there are very important differences. However, I think that, as a sociologist and looking deeper at some of the roots as well as ramifications of these two events, compelling points of comparison arise. I would say that primarily these have to do with the roots in the social disparity in terms of the impact of these disasters. So, and this is something that received perhaps more media attention in Katrina than it did in New York. The vast majority of people who were affected negatively by 9/11 were poor people, people of color, working class people, people making on average $11 an hour and under were 60% of those who lost their jobs following 9/11. Nonetheless, the representation was one in which the financial firms and high-end financial workers were the ones who were primarily affected. And I think that has a lot to do with something I'll talk about in a second, which has to do with the post-70s representation and development of New York City. But so, in that sense, the disproportionate effects of Katrina obviously were felt by those who were also disproportionately in the floodplain, who were poor people and people of color and working class people in New Orleans, as had been experienced in previous hurricanes in New Orleans. And I think that's a similarity between the two cities. In addition, and this is something I'll talk about in a little bit, the response by the federal government, starting with 9/11, was one that was what some theorists would call a neoliberal or market-centered response that really depended largely on the private sector far more than traditional forms of federal granting and relief to solve the problems of the recovery. This was something that was kind of tested and experimented on in New York and ultimately reproduced in New Orleans, using actually the example of New York as a model. But for my talk today, before I get to those more recent points, I want to speak briefly about some of these broader areas that we might think about for comparison. And the first is the issue of urban exceptionalism itself. I think that when you think about comparing New York and New Orleans, and the title of my talk, and I think the direction of this panel, the question of urban exceptionalism, what does it mean? How do we use it as a category in social sciences and history, is one that I'd like to actually spend perhaps most of my short time today talking about. And then following that, in thinking about urban exceptionalism, particularly in times of crisis, talking about the period of the 1970s for New York and New Orleans, and then bringing us back up to the post-Katrina and post-9/11 period at the end. And ultimately, I think this comparison offers an important opportunity for us to not only compare New York and New Orleans, but to think more critically about the growing role of cities at the epicenter of crisis globally, whether in environmental, economic, political, or broadly social terms. So I'm going to start by thinking sort of speculatively about this category, the genealogy of this category of urban exceptionalism, which I've been finding really fascinating, the way that it's invoked increasingly in this period. And I'm not a historian. I am a great, and I'm someone who does a lot of social history. And so one of my motivations for working with Anne, Linnell, and Amy on this panel, and also coming here, and is thinking historically about this category. And I'm just going to say preliminarily that it's been used very differently in thinking about cities going back to the founding of the nation. It's been, two terms have been used: urban exceptionalism and exceptional cities. And often when urban exceptionalism has been used as a broader category, it's been used in conjunction with the notion of anti-urbanism, and I think that that's really significant. So the way that many of us have so far been talking about urban exceptionalism, does New Orleans, does New York, and I think New York was thought of in very similar ways, constitute a part of this nation? Is it somehow different? Has tied in very much with a strain of anti-urbanism that goes back certainly to, most famously, Thomas Jefferson, and to the period of the early period of the Republic. I think that it's significant that that was also, in a sense, a post-crisis moment. And I think that, drawing inspiration from the work of the social theorist William Sewell, it's important to look at events, and particularly, in my view, events of crisis and rupture, and then the effort to rebuild subsequently, as moments that are times of crystallizing national imaginings, of directing the nation such as it is, this imagined community of the nation, in a different direction. And in times such as those that have occurred, very periodically over the course of American history, cities and the role of cities have become flashpoints. This question of urban exceptionalism, who constitutes an American, who deserves full citizenship rights and so forth, has been defined in spatial terms, in terms of urban versus rural, and regional terms, and places like on the coast, for instance, where many of the larger cities are congregated versus the heartland kinds of terms, and the central part of the Midwestern part of the country, in ways that are very similar to and overlap with racial and economic, gender and sexual terms. And so I think we have to think about those overlaps